When Captain Abid Sultan arrived at Dhaka airport that morning, no one could have imagined the emotional whirlwind he carried within him. A man admired for his skills in the cockpit, yet silently criticized by his professional peers, he bore a growing unease that weighed heavier with each passing moment. His demeanor foreshadowed that this day would be unlike any other. That morning, the captain submitted his resignation as a pilot for US-Bangla shortly before departing on what would be his final flight as captain of the airline. No one aboard the Dash 8 knew that this would not be just another day in the skies. March 12, 2018. Hazrat Shah Jalal International Airport, Dhaka, Bangladesh. It's 12:30 p.m. and here, US-Bangla Airlines Flight 211 is preparing to depart for Nepal, heading to the well-known Tribhuvan Airport, nestled among the mountains. The aircraft is a Dash 8 Q400, a turboprop designed for short to medium-haul regional flights. Thanks to its efficient design, it consumes less fuel than similar jet-powered aircraft, making it both more economical and environmentally friendly. Although it is a turboprop, the Q400 can reach a cruising speed of up to 667 km per hour, nearly matching some regional jets. The aircraft has a seating capacity of up to 86 passengers, depending on its configuration, and is well known for operating in airports with short runways or challenging conditions. The Q400's wings are unusually long for an aircraft of its size. This enhances its aerodynamics and provides excellent takeoff and landing performance. Developed by de Havilland Canada and later manufactured by Bombardier Aerospace, the Dash 8 Q400 has gained a reputation for reliability and low operating costs, with more than 1,200 aircraft in the Dash 8 family used worldwide. At the controls of Flight 211 is Captain Abid Sultan, a 52-year-old experienced pilot with nearly 6,000 flight hours, 1,700 of them on this type of aircraft. He had flown to Kathmandu more than 100 times, making him highly familiar with Tribhuvan Airport. Alongside him is First Officer Prithula Rashid, a 25-year-old recent hire with only 390 flight hours. She had never flown to Kathmandu before, but she was known for being a quick learner and had scored highly in her training exams. The crew was completed by 2 flight attendants, and together with 67 passengers, a total of 71 people were on board US-Bangla Airlines Flight 211. Abid Sultan had been flying commercial aircraft since 2002 and had previously served in the Bangladesh Air Force, but he was discharged in 1993 due to depression. However, medical evaluations during the 2000s found no signs that he was unfit to fly. He was also a habitual smoker, and while his superiors were informally aware of it, he did not consistently disclose it in his medical examinations, sometimes stating that he had never smoked. Despite everything, he had a reputation for being competent, professional, kind, and mature in his role at the airline. At 12:51 p.m., the turboprop began taxiing down the runway. They took off without any issues and started their journey toward Kathmandu, located just over an hour and a half away from Bangladesh. The flight proceeded smoothly, but in the cockpit, the captain was tearfully sharing his troubles with the inexperienced first officer. Apparently, he had discovered that a colleague had criticized his professionalism and his ability as a training instructor. Abid Sultan took this very personally, to the point where he began adopting a highly negative attitude.
I can't take this anymore. I've submitted my resignation.
After this, he continued speaking, wondering out loud what he could do for a living if he were no longer a pilot. Eventually, Sultan pulled out a pack of cigarettes and started smoking. At several points, he broke down completely, expressing how deeply hurt he was by his colleague's criticism, and ended up shouting, "I don't give a damn about flight safety." The first officer did not respond at any point. She simply listened and continued with her duties. After about an hour in the air, the crew began making the initial preparations for the approach to Kathmandu. Captain Sultan started giving instructions to First Officer Rashid regarding the most critical aspects of the landing. He seemed to regain his composure, as his comments were calm and precise. At 2:10 p.m., with Rashid handling the radio, the approach controller in Kathmandu instructed Flight 211 to fly to the Goras waypoint and enter a holding pattern. In response, the crew programmed the hold into the flight computer. Shortly after, Captain Sultan began to break down again, delivering an incomplete approach briefing. This certainly did not help either pilot fully understand the complex approach from the south to runway 02 at Tribhuvan Airport. Minutes later, the approach controller cancelled the previous holding instruction and cleared Flight 211 for a direct approach. The crew acknowledged the instruction, but the first officer, responsible for deleting the holding pattern from the flight computer, failed to do so, perhaps too nervous because the captain was still crying and smoking. When the aircraft reached the Goras waypoint, the autopilot initiated a left turn to enter the pre-programmed holding pattern. They remained in this pattern for several minutes until the approach controller radioed to confirm whether they had understood the clearance and were proceeding with the direct approach. The crew responded affirmatively, realizing their mistake. Captain Sultan then lit another cigarette, switched the autopilot to heading mode, and selected a northeast heading to rejoin the correct approach path. The aircraft remained at an altitude that was too high because the captain's heading change had prevented the autopilot from beginning the descent in time. Eventually, Sultan resumed the descent, but the aircraft was still too high for the approach. Meanwhile, the pilots began reviewing the landing checklist, a task that should have been completed much earlier. However, they also made mistakes during this process. When First Officer Rashid requested the landing gear to be lowered, Captain Sultan did not do so. Instead, he responded automatically, "Gear down, 3 green," referring to the indicator lights that confirm the gear is deployed. Neither pilot actually checked the lights, which were off because the landing gear had not been extended. It was clear that both crew members were losing control of the situation during one of the most challenging approaches a pilot can face. As the aircraft neared the approach path, the crew failed to adjust their heading northward, causing Flight 211 to drift to the right of the airport. As the off-course approach continued, Captain Sultan incorrectly set the minimum safe altitude and repeatedly asked to perform the landing checklist, despite having already completed it earlier. Moments later, the alarm warning that the landing gear was not deployed began sounding in the cockpit. Finally, the approach controller realized that Flight 211 was heading northeast and was overshooting the airport.
Are you landing on runway 02 or 20?
Captain Sultan, now handling the radio in addition to flying the aircraft, confirmed that they were heading for runway 02. However, he continued flying past the airport, seemingly believing he was still farther away. Flight 211 continued descending, triggering the aircraft's ground proximity warnings. The aircraft was heading straight toward a mountain. Realizing the danger, Captain Sultan took full manual control and executed a sharp 270-degree right turn. He banked aggressively, up to 45 degrees at just 175 feet above the ground, which simultaneously triggered both bank angle and ground proximity alerts. As he leveled out heading west, perpendicular to the runway threshold, Sultan climbed back to 6,500 feet, narrowly passing over the northern end of the airport. Now hopelessly lost, he continued flying west while once again asking Rashid for the landing checklist. She reminded him that they had already completed it, 20 minutes ago. The controller, almost as confused as the pilots, cleared Flight 211 to land on either runway, seeing that the captain was unable to align with runway 02. Captain Sultan then entered another right-hand loop, turning more than 180 degrees until they were flying southeast. From an altitude of over 5,000 feet, First Officer Rashid spotted the runway to her right. To everyone's surprise, Captain Sultan immediately attempted to align with it, rolling sharply to the right and descending rapidly. Flying more like a fighter jet than a turboprop carrying over 70 passengers. Meanwhile, Rashid sat frozen in silence, but despite her shock, she realized that the landing gear was still retracted and activated its deployment. Flight 211 hurtled toward the airport perimeter, heading straight for the control tower. Passing so close that the air traffic controllers stood up, believing their final moment had come. With warnings blaring at full volume in the cockpit, Flight 211 flew over a hangar and a parking apron. Seconds later, it touched down diagonally across the runway, veered off to the left, crashed into an embankment, and erupted into flames. The crash instantly killed many passengers seated on the left side, as well as both pilots. Those who survived found themselves trapped in an inferno, as the fire quickly consumed the aircraft. Some survivors managed to flee on foot, while others were rescued from the wreckage. Firefighters extinguished the blaze within 15 minutes, but for most on board, it was already too late. 22 passengers were rushed to hospitals, where 2 later succumbed to their injuries, raising the death toll to 51 and leaving only 20 survivors. Among the deceased were both flight attendants, Captain Abid Sultan and First Officer Prithula Rashid. What had happened? What did the final report conclude? While initial interpretations of the air traffic control transcripts suggested that controllers were confused, the investigation revealed that the true source of their confusion was the highly erratic behavior of Flight 211. The heartbreaking cockpit voice recording showed that Captain Abid Sultan spent much of the flight experiencing an apparent emotional breakdown, triggered by his colleagues' criticism of his flying abilities. During this episode, he smoked, cried, and became completely unfit to fly. Agitated, distracted, and upset, he was unable to focus on flying the aircraft, leading to numerous basic procedural failures. He forgot to erase the holding pattern from the flight computer, failed to properly conduct an approach briefing, did not re-intercept the glide path, lost awareness of his position, neglected to lower the landing gear, and more. This demonstrated a total lack of situational awareness caused by his disturbed mental state. Investigators also questioned why the crew did not execute a missed approach and tried to realign with the runway. It is likely that Captain Sultan developed tunnel vision, so fixated on landing the aircraft that he could barely think beyond pointing the plane at the runway. He may have been in such a state that he could not think of anything else, or he may have lost control to the point where he simply stopped caring about proper procedures. Either way, the result was a dangerously unstable approach that led to the aircraft landing misaligned by 25 degrees. Another pressing question was why First Officer Prithula Rashid never intervened to correct any of Captain Sultan's errors. Sultan was twice her age and had 14 times her experience, making it difficult for her to justify contradicting his decisions. She had never flown to Kathmandu before and was not particularly familiar with the approach, so she relied on the captain's judgment. Additionally, Sultan had just spent the past hour ranting about a colleague who had criticized his flying ability, something Rashid undoubtedly kept in mind when deciding whether to correct him. During the final approach, she may have been so terrified by the captain's actions that she was unable to react, as evidenced by her near-complete absence in the last moments of the cockpit voice recording. The Accident Investigation Commission determined that the probable cause of the accident was the captain's disorientation and complete loss of situational awareness. The aircraft deviated from the proper approach path, prompting the captain to execute highly dangerous maneuvers in an attempt to align with the runway. The landing was made in a state of sheer desperation after the runway was finally spotted. No attempt was made to execute a missed approach, even though such a maneuver remained possible until the final moments before touchdown. The sole Bangladeshi representative on the investigation team publicly criticized the final report, claiming it ignored the fact that air traffic controllers failed to fulfill their duties properly. He argued that they could have provided navigational assistance once it became evident that the pilots were disoriented, but they did not. He also stated that if controllers had done so, the accident might have been prevented,